Hey, Betty, can you explain, because when you first described this action of three-dimensional hip mobility in from the perspective of an athlete on the ice, that really made a lot of sense, but I didn't think about it that way. Can you explain to us exactly what makes a good skater at the NHL level in terms of edging, and then what is required from the hip in order to facilitate, either the inside edge or the outside edge, depending on, what makes them best? Because you described this kind of one to forward relationship between striding. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Well, obviously, when you look at the skate boot now, you see that we don't, as a hockey player, the hockey player doesn't get a lot of mobility or movement out of the ankle joints. So really, we've talked about this before, that really it requires a fairly mobile hip, or a hip that can generate three-dimensional forces very, very effectively if a player is going to be able to demonstrate good strength on the ice, or good skating ability, or the ability to be able to pivot and move and be able to get low and maintain position and develop proper angling. But, when we look at specifically what that hockey player should be able to do, we always talk about the fact that, typically hockey players, it's not a linear game. They're not skating forward all the time. They're actually moving east-west a lot of the time. They're always looking at using crossover steps. In fact, I saw a study, and there's a number of colleagues around especially in Canada here, where they've been studying, the best players and what they do in terms of the number of crossover steps versus the number of forward steps. And the best players in the game will only ever take, 3.5 forward skating strides for every crossover step. Players that are less skilled will tend to take more forward steps, but they don't seem to gain the same amount of opportunity, or they don't seem to have the same amount of success. So what's interesting about that is that, players that typically don't like to use the crossover sequencing, or tend to skate more north-south, they typically aren't as good of a skater. So they either their body's not, hardwired or able to be able to generate that lateral movement that they need, and a lot of that comes from being able to generate a proper crossover step. But so if you look at the mechanics of what an individual has to be able to do, the player's got to be able to get to their inside leg, but when they're in the inside leg, they've got to be able to get on the outside edge of that inside leg. And there's a tremendous amount of stability and angling that's required in order to be able to do that. But more importantly, the player's got to then be able to then generate three-dimensional hip movement to be able to get out of that and into their second step. And so, we always talk about the hip's ability to be able to, 80 duct, and then be able to, not only be able to internally rotate, but also be able to then extend out of that position. So when you think about this from a movement perspective, it's a fairly complex movement. And let's not forget that while you're doing this, you're performing it at high speed. And secondly, you're performing this sequencing of movement that really the best players in the game obviously are the ones that are able to do it the best and have the greatest success. And so, when you translate this back to this whole thing of, what leads to success for a player, it's the ability to be able to take these very important movement patterns and demands and be able to translate this as best they can into personal success, so they can have more success in the game.
And often when you think about this, you described what the hip has to go through in order to get proper edging and accelerate forward, because ultimately they would use a skate edge to kind of, use the ice to turn out of and accelerate out of a corner. Even though they're striding forward, they're using the angles and the edging and this idea of circular patterns on the ice to gain acceleration. Yes. And what is required at the hip is, you described this idea of internal rotation, adduction, and extension, which is actually antithetical to our normal motions of the hip in terms of gait. So when we think about it from a capsular perspective, you're actually winding up the ligaments of the hip joint tighter in order to facilitate that. So my big thing would be, biomechanically, if we've got relative motions at the hip that wind up tighter, if I've got a restriction in the hip capsule, and I cannot create forces in different hip positions, it doesn't matter how much leg strength I have at that point. I'm actually bleeding energy out because I'm not that efficient in my skating abilities, because I can't get into the requisite joint motions in order to facilitate the best and most efficient stride. So then again, strength, this conversation of strength then becomes, is it movement and position specific as well? Because biomechanics and skating mechanics come into this conversation as well. It's not just, can I sit, like I said before, in a linear load pattern and exert a force against it, and the more I can do that, the better off I'm going to be. There's a lot more elements in flux, as you described, in order for me to have strength and effective actions of power and force generation on the ice.
No, absolutely. Like, I mean, it's really, the game of hockey is very complex, and I don't mean to, put it ahead of any other sport, but really, when you look at the skating, it's very, it's a very unique demand that a player has to encompass, and I mean, you put it best. The fact that the player, has to be able to do this multitude of movements within the hip joint in order to be able to have success. I mean, that becomes such a big component of what we look at relative to what we would condition or what we would try to serve to correctively condition, as opposed to just having them lay under a bench or having them drop underneath the squat bar and try and work on increasing, their ability to come out of a squat position. They may not need that. They may be, you may need to be looking at other aspects of strength relative to, the individual needs of that player. So it's a very, it's like everything now, it's becoming very, very specific to what it is the player has to go survive. And it's not what we would look at normally traditionally in the sort of traditional strength environments.
And that's probably one of the things that you and I first saw, 7.5, 8 years ago now when we had the first prototypes for Viper, was that we could actually, from a motor learning perspective, from a metabolic perspective, from a strength gain perspective, we could actually be unencumbered in terms of what positions our joints could be in to increase positional strength, stability, and even force generation. And that's where, the four of us were in the back of the room, you, myself, my brother, and Paul Graham, where, we're just going through our Rochambeau sessions where we were saying, okay, what can we do with this thing in order to allow the freedom of motion to exist with load, and then have that load, that resistance, and that adaptation take place so that it can ultimately transfer into a better and more effective atmosphere for any sport, any activity, any individual. But, with respect to hockey right now, what are some of the things in your mind that young kids are doing that perhaps they are not doing correctly, or that they should be changing in order to survive the rigors of the sport?
Well, interesting. That's a great question, because I actually am very enlightened and impressed with what I'm seeing right now from an industry, because so many of the programs have shifted towards a real strong emphasis towards moving players more correctly, or moving players more efficiently, and using whole body patterning. And
you were just in Wisconsin with a bunch of coaches too, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's where, I mentioned to you that Jim Snyder, who's the head of strength and conditioning there, when I mentioned, the prospects of Viper, how he got really excited and optimistic about, what it could do for him in his program, and how it could allow him to continue to further the work that he's done and the changes that he's made in his training. Because as you and I both know, a lot of the models that come out of a lot of the university levels are Olympic lifting models of training, and that, not that those are incorrect, but the reality is that it was, so fairly linear. It wasn't, it didn't allow coaches at that level to be able to really adopt a real strong movement-based program. And, when I talked to him about the prospects of Viper and how by manipulating, the use of Viper, how it could actually get players to really, create motions in their body at all major segments of the body in ways that would facilitate, improvements in strength. And so we're back to that whole concept of strength. But I really think that I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing out there as far as, what's happening in movement. But I think we need to continue to push, the available opportunities to continue to expand our knowledge and expand our tools that we would use to facilitate this, this emphasis on movement, and gain even stronger, richer understanding of what it means and how we need to continue it. Because we still tend to, as a group, gravitate back to those more traditional lifts, and bench press is one that comes up, and we really simply don't need to default back there because we're second guessing, our training methods, or we're hoping that somebody doesn't get tested off the bench, because if they get tested off the bench, then typically if I've got them in a strong movement-based program, they're going to not necessarily perform well because I haven't done any of that sort of targeted work. But if we can continue to move the bar and move our understanding of things, we can move the testing parameters out. relative to how we actually assess the readiness of a player.
Yeah.
Before they begin season.
And even Ryan's, discounted that because, although he might not be strong in traditional list, boy, he's strong when he gets on the ice too, right? So
it's crazy. Like I'm always, Ryan is a very good example of, he's got this body and, he can't bench press, but you cannot move the guy off the puck. You cannot move him out of position. Once he's got himself, like when he plays the game, players will tell you that he's the strongest guy on the puck. You can't lift his stick. You cannot get to the puck. He protects it very well. And if you talk to if you lined up our, administrative staff and scouting staff and said, listen, what do you want in a player? First thing they're going to tell you is they're going to want a player that has a good head for the game. So they want a smart player. Mm-hmm. But secondly, they're going to talk about the intangibles, toughness, competitiveness, willing to compete for the puck. What they're talking about is essentially how strong is that player on the puck and how well does he protect that puck? Because at the end of the day, the space and time is very limited for a player. And if you're easily pushed off the puck or you can't handle a stick on your hip or you don't like traffic and so forth, you're not going to have a lot of success in the game. So, we're always talking about dynamic strength. It's got to be strength that has application to the game. And so typically, if I've got a great bench press, it's not necessarily going to translate into the type of success that I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that example after example after example.